My mother had a ring just like that, the waitress tells the CEO, and upon hearing it, he freezes. Melissa Parker was balancing a tray of coffee when her legs nearly gave out. The elegant man who had just sat at table 15 wore a ring she knew better than anything in the world, a blue sapphire ring with unique gold details, identical to the one she kept at home as the only heirloom from her mother. "My mother had a ring just like that," she said in a trembling voice, pointing to the businessman's right hand. The grey-haired man in the impeccable suit paled instantly, as if he'd seen a ghost appear in the middle of The Monarch, one of the most upscale restaurants in New York. Richard Blackwell tried to mask his shock, but his fingers trembled as he raised the cup to his lips. 43 years running one of the largest construction companies in the country had taught him to keep his composure in any situation. But this young waitress in her beige uniform had just shaken all his certainties. "It must be a coincidence, miss. Rings like this are common," he replied, avoiding looking directly at Melissa. She shook her head, pulling a thin chain with a ring from her blouse pocket. "No, sir. This one is unique. My mother always said it was part of a special pair, custom-made decades ago. Both have the same jeweler's mark on the side." Richard froze. The discreet mark on the inner side of the ring was something only 3 people in the world knew, and 2 of them were no longer alive, or at least that's what he had believed until now. "Excuse me, I need to take an urgent call," Richard lied, standing abruptly and nearly knocking over his chair. Melissa watched the powerful man hurry toward the restroom, but not before noticing he had dropped some papers from his briefcase. Without hesitation, she bent down to pick them up, trying to be helpful. Among the business documents, an old photo caught her eye. 2 young women smiled at the camera wearing 1980s-style dresses. Both wore identical rings on their right hands. One of them had a familiar face, strikingly similar to the few photos Melissa had of her mother in her youth. "Excuse me, sir, you dropped these," she said when Richard returned, handing him the documents with trembling hands. Richard snatched the papers from her grip with more force than he intended. "Thank you. Now I must leave. I have an important meeting." "Wait, please. This photo isn't one of these women Emily Parker. She had the same eyes, the same smile as my mother." Richard stopped mid-step, closing his eyes as if fighting physical pain. When he opened them again, there was a mix of desperation and something that looked like guilt. "I don't know what you're talking about. You must be confusing her with someone else." "Mr. Blackwell," the restaurant manager interrupted, rushing over. "I apologize for the disturbance. Melissa, return to your work immediately. Sir, you are a very important guest and cannot be bothered like this." Melissa felt her blood boil. "I'm not bothering anyone. I just want to understand why this man has a ring identical to my mother's." "Enough," the manager snapped. "If you keep this up, you're fired. Now go serve the other tables." Richard watched silently, seeing the determination in the young woman's brown eyes. They were the same eyes that had haunted him for decades, the ones that appeared in his most frequent nightmares. "It's fine," he finally told the manager. "The young lady did nothing wrong, but I really must go." Before Melissa could say another word, Richard left the restaurant as if fleeing something terrible. At the door, he paused for a moment and looked back, meeting the waitress's pleading gaze. For a moment, it seemed like he might turn back, but he shook his head and disappeared into the crowd on Fifth Avenue. Melissa spent the rest of the day distracted, burning the milk for the cappuccino and mixing up orders. Her mind couldn't let go of that photo. The resemblance between one of the women and her mother was too striking to be a coincidence. When her shift ended, she went straight home to the small apartment she shared with 2 roommates on the East Side. In her cramped bedroom, she rummaged through the cardboard box where she kept the few mementos of her mother. Among the yellowed photos, she found one that had always puzzled her. Emily Parker appeared alone, but her hand was outstretched as if someone had been beside her, cropped from the image. In the background, part of a sign reading Blackwell Conway was visible. The rest was cut off, but now Melissa was starting to connect the dots. The next morning, she arrived early to work and approached Dorothy, the restaurant's longest-serving employee. Dorothy, you know the regular customers well, don't you? Of course, dear. I've worked here 15 years. Why? That man from yesterday, Richard Blackwell. Does he come here often? The older woman smiled. Ah, Dr. Blackwell, of course I know him. He's come here every Monday for about 10 years, always asks for table 15, and always seems so melancholy. Poor man, must have his share of sorrows. Melissa's heart raced. Melancholic how? Well, I shouldn't gossip about customers, but that man carries a sadness that's painful to see. Sometimes he stares out the window with tears in his eyes. Once I even heard him muttering to himself, "Should have done things differently. Must have lost someone very important." During lunch, Melissa went to the public library and searched for Richard Blackwell online. She discovered he was a widower. His wife had died in a car accident 5 years earlier. He had an adult daughter living in London and ran Blackwell Construction, a family business founded in the 1970s. But it was in an old newspaper article that she found something truly intriguing. A photo of a young Richard with his parents captioned, "The Blackwell family inaugurates new company headquarters in 1981. In the background, a few employees were visible. A young woman in uniform was arranging flowers in a vase. Melissa nearly gasped in the quiet library. It was her mother, no doubt about it. Emily Parker had worked for the Blackwell family 40 years ago. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers out. Now back to the story. That night, Melissa barely slept. The next day, she arrived at work determined to uncover more about the connection between her mother and Richard Blackwell. But to her surprise, Dorothy sought her out with a worried expression. "Melissa, I need to tell you something. Last night, Dr. Blackwell called asking about you. Wanted to know your full name, how long you'd worked here, things like that." Melissa's heart pounded. "What did you tell him?" "Just the basics, that you're a good employee. But he seemed very nervous. Asked if you'd mentioned anything about someone named Emily Parker." Melissa was stunned. So he had known her mother. It wasn't a coincidence or her imagination. "Dorothy, do you know where I can find Dr. Blackwell outside of here?" The older woman hesitated. "Well, I shouldn't say this, but I know he visits St. Clair Nursing Home in Greenwich Village every Tuesday. His mother lives there. But don't do anything reckless, all right?" Melissa took the following Tuesday off, lying about a doctor's appointment. She arrived at St. Clair Nursing Home mid-morning, hoping to intercept Richard. The place was elegant, with well-kept gardens and classic architecture. Melissa hid behind a tree in the parking lot, feeling like an amateur spy. At 10:30, a black Lexus arrived, and Richard stepped out of the car carrying a bouquet of white roses. Melissa waited a few minutes before entering the reception area. "Good morning. I'm looking for a job here. Are you hiring?" The receptionist, a friendly middle-aged woman, smiled. "Not at the moment, but you can leave your resume. What kind of work are you looking for?" "Anything. Front desk, cleaning, kitchen work. I have restaurant experience." While pretending to fill out a form, Melissa watched Richard talking to a nurse down the hallway. He seemed to be asking about a specific patient. "Excuse me," Melissa said to the receptionist. "May I use the restroom?" "Of course, it's at the end of the hall, on the left." Melissa headed in the direction she was given, but stopped when she heard Richard's voice coming from a nearby room. "How is she today, nurse?" "Mrs. Margaret is doing well, Mr. Blackwell, but she keeps asking for that box of old photos. She says she has something important to tell you." Richard sighed deeply. "We've talked about this. Some memories are better left buried." "But she insists it's about a promise she made 40 years ago. Something about a child she was supposed to take care of." Melissa's legs trembled. She leaned against the wall, trying to process what she'd just heard. A 40-year-old promise about a child. Could it be possible that... "Richard," called a frail voice from inside the room. "Is that you, my son?" "I'm here, Mother," Richard replied, stepping inside. Melissa moved closer to the slightly open door, catching a glimpse of the room. An elderly woman with white hair sat on the bed, holding a wooden box in her lap. "Son, I need to tell you about Emily. I can't carry this guilt any longer." "Mother, please don't torture yourself over this. The past is the past. No, the woman interrupted with surprising strength. I broke a sacred promise, Richard. Emily asked me to take care of her daughter if anything happened to her, and I failed. I abandoned that child out of fear, out of selfishness. Melissa covered her mouth to stifle a gasp. Her mother had made a promise? Someone was supposed to have taken care of her? Richard moved closer to his mother. Mother, you did what you thought was best at the time. There was no way to know. What I thought was best? Leaving an 8-year-old child alone in the world was what I thought was best. Emily trusted me, Richard. We made a vow when we were young. We promised to care for each other's children if anything happened. Melissa pressed herself harder against the wall, tears beginning to stream down her face. 8 years old. She had been exactly 8 when her mother had to leave, leaving her with a distant aunt who barely knew her. "Where are the rings, Mother?" Richard asked, his voice thick with emotion. The woman opened the box and took out 2 identical rings, both with blue sapphires and gold detailing. "Here they are. Emily and I had them made when we became godmothers to each other's children. She took one when she moved away, and I kept the other. They were a symbol of our friendship and the promise we made." Richard took one of the rings and examined it. "This one is mine, Mother. The one you have is Emily's." "No, son. After Emily passed, I managed to get her ring back. I couldn't bear the thought of her daughter keeping it. It was a constant reminder of my failure. I had a copy made for you to wear, so at least part of the promise would be honored, even if indirectly." Melissa felt the world spin. Richard was wearing a copy of her mother's ring, and Mrs. Margaret had the original. "Mother, where is that child now? She must be about 48. "I have no idea," Margaret confessed, her voice full of remorse. "I lost track of her after she left her aunt's house. I tried looking a few times, but I didn't have the courage to face what I had done." Melissa could no longer hold back. She knocked lightly on the door and entered the room, making Richard turn quickly with an expression of complete surprise. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling. "My name is Melissa Parker. Emily Parker was my mother." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard turned pale as a sheet, and Mrs. Margaret dropped the box on the floor, scattering old photos across the room. "It can't be," Margaret murmured. You're Emily's daughter." Melissa pulled the ring from her pocket. "Yes, and this is the ring my mother left me. The real one, not a copy." Richard staggered to a chair and sat down heavily. "How did you find us?" Melissa told them about the encounter at the restaurant, the photo he had dropped, and her research. With every word, Richard's expression grew more anguished. "I knew," he finally said. "When I saw you at the restaurant, I knew immediately who you were. You have the same eyes as Emily, the same way of tilting your head when you're thinking." Margaret reached out with trembling hands to Melissa. "My dear child, no, you're a woman now. Can you ever forgive me? I know I have no right to ask, but..." Melissa looked at the elderly woman, seeing the sincerity and remorse in her eyes. "Why? Why did you abandon me?" Margaret began to cry. "Because I was afraid that dividing my love and our resources would hurt Richard's future. He was my only son, and I thought taking care of you would diminish his opportunities. It was pure selfishness, and I've regretted it every day since." Richard stood abruptly. "Mother, how could you say that? You raised me as an accomplice to a terrible injustice." "But you didn't know, son. You were too young when it all happened." "I did know," Richard exploded. "Do you think I don't remember Emily? Do you think I don't remember playing with a little girl who sometimes appeared at the house? I asked about her, and you always changed the subject." Melissa felt her world turn upside down. "You remember me?" Richard looked at her with tear-filled eyes. "I remember a little girl with braids who loved playing house in the garden. You always insisted on caring for the dolls as if they were real babies. Emily said you'd be a wonderful mother one day." Melissa's tears now flowed freely. "I vaguely remember playing in a big garden with an older boy who protected me when I fell. I thought it was just dreams." "They weren't dreams," Richard said, stepping closer. "You used to call me Richie because you couldn't say Richard properly." "Richie!" The word shot out of Melissa's mouth. "Richie, who looked after me when the adults were talking." Richard could no longer hold back and embraced Melissa, both crying like children. Margaret watched from the bed, her tears mixing guilt and relief. "I need to know about my mother," Melissa said when they pulled apart. "What happened to her? Why did she have to leave?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Emily worked for our family for many years. She was more than an employee. She was like a sister to me. When she found out she was sick, that she didn't have much time, she made me promise to care for you as if you were my own daughter." "Sick how?" Melissa asked. "She had a heart condition. The doctors said it was congenital, that she was born with a defect that couldn't be fixed back then. Emily fought it for years, but in the end..." Melissa sank heavily into the chair beside the bed. "My mother had a heart condition, and she knew she would leave me." Margaret nodded. "She spent her last months arranging everything for you. She left a letter, some photos, and made me swear you'd grow up with all the love and opportunities she couldn't give you anymore." "And where is that letter?" asked Melissa, her voice choked with emotion. Margaret pointed to a cabinet in the corner of the room. "I stored everything in a box up there. I never had the courage to open it after what I did." Richard climbed onto a chair and brought down a dusty box. Inside were photos of Emily and Melissa as a child, some documents, and a sealed letter with the words "To my dear Melissa," written in delicate handwriting. With trembling hands, Melissa opened the letter and began reading aloud. "My dear daughter, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer by your side to protect and love you as I wished. I know Margaret will take care of you as she promised, because she has a generous heart and understands the value of true friendship. Don't be sad, my angel. Life sometimes takes us down different paths, but the love I feel for you will always live on, no matter where I am. Be strong, be kind, and always remember that you were the greatest joy of my life. With all my love, your mother, who will never forget you, Emily." The silence that followed was broken only by Margaret's sobs. "She trusted me," the elderly woman murmured, "and I failed her, I failed you, I failed myself." Melissa carefully folded the letter and looked at Margaret. "You kept this for 40 years? Margaret nodded. "Every day I looked at that box and felt the weight of my broken promise. I tried to convince myself you'd be better off without our interference, but deep down I knew I was being a coward." Richard walked to the window, gazing at the garden outside. "Melissa, you should know I tried to look for you a few times over the years." "What do you mean?" "When I turned 18, I managed to convince my mother to give me some information about where you might be. I found the aunt who was taking care of you, but I learned you had left her house at 16. I lost track of you after that." Melissa remembered those difficult years. She had indeed left Aunt Bertha's house at 16, unable to bear living where she didn't feel welcome. She spent years working lousy jobs, sleeping in cheap boarding houses, struggling to survive. "After I graduated, I kept searching," Richard said. "I hired a private detective a few times, but New York is huge, and you had changed your name a few times, working under the table." "Changed my name?" Melissa asked, confused. "Sometimes I used my aunt's name, sometimes just my first name. It was easier to get work that way, remember?" Melissa nodded, vaguely recalling the tricks she used to get jobs as a minor. 5 years ago," Richard said, "I finally got a lead that led to you. I found out you were working at the Monarch. That's why I started going there every Monday." Melissa stared at him wide-eyed. "You knew I worked there." Richard lowered his head. "I did, but I didn't have the courage to approach you. What would I say? 'Hi, I'm the son of the woman who promised to take care of you and failed.' I thought it would be better just to watch from afar, to make sure you were okay." Watch from afar. Melissa felt a mix of anger and confusion. "For 5 years you went to the restaurant knowing who I was and never said a word." Richard turned to her, his eyes full of pain. "Because I'm a coward, Melissa. Because I carried the guilt of my mother's neglect my whole life and didn't know how to face it. Every time I saw you waiting tables, earning little, clearly struggling to get by, I hated myself a little more." Margaret intervened in a frail voice. "Son, you need to tell her what you did." "Tell me what?" Melissa asked. Richard hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Melissa, do you remember having some bills paid anonymously over the years? Some opportunities that came out of nowhere?" Melissa thought for a moment. "There were a few times." When I was sick and couldn't afford the doctor, someone paid the bill. When I lost my job 3 years ago and was about to be evicted, anonymous help appeared. I always thought it was some charity. It was me, Richard confessed. It wasn't much. I never wanted it to seem suspicious. Just a few timely assists when I found out you were struggling. Melissa stayed silent for a long moment, processing all the revelations. So both of you knew who I was, where I was, how I lived, but chose to keep your distance. Margaret shifted in bed, trying to sit up better. Melissa, dear, you have every right to be angry. But you need to understand we've lived with this guilt all these years. Richard grew up carrying the weight of what I did. I don't want your apologies, Melissa said, standing up. I want to understand why my life was so hard when it didn't have to be. Why I went hungry when there were people who promised to care for me. Why I felt abandoned in the world when people knew exactly where I was. Richard stepped closer. You're right to be upset. We have no excuses for what we did. I should have had the courage to reach out years ago. Should have? Melissa laughed bitterly. You spent 5 years drinking coffee while I waited on your tables, knowing my situation and thought bigger tips would make up for a lifetime of abandonment. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers. Now, back to it. Just then, the door opened and a nurse walked in. Sorry, but it's time for Mrs. Margaret's medication, and we need to keep the environment calm. Richard looked at Melissa. Can we continue this somewhere else? I have so much more to tell you. Melissa hesitated. I don't know if I want to hear more. I've learned more about my life this morning than in 40 years. Please, Margaret insisted, don't leave angry. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but at least let me try to make amends. Melissa looked at the elderly woman, seeing the sincerity in her tired eyes. Fine, but I want to know everything. No more secrets. Richard nodded. I promise. Let's go somewhere we can talk quietly. They left the nursing home together in tense silence. Richard took her to a nearby cafe, away from the city bustle. Sitting at a corner table, he began, Melissa, you need to understand my mother isn't a bad person. She was a single mother in the 1970s, raising a child alone while trying to keep a business afloat. When my father died, she was desperate. That doesn't excuse what she did, Melissa replied. No, it doesn't, but it explains it, at least partly. She was afraid caring for you would mean splitting resources we barely had. Blackwell Construction was nearly bankrupt back then. Melissa stirred her coffee mechanically. And my mother? How did she fit into all this? Richard smiled sadly. Emily was like family. She started working for us when I was little, but quickly became more than an employee. She was my mother's best friend, the person she trusted most in the world. And when they found out she was sick, Richard's smile faded. It was devastating. Emily was young, not even 30. When the doctors said she didn't have much time, my mother fell apart. Emily was desperate too, but not for herself. For me, Melissa finished. For you. All she talked about was making sure you were safe and loved. That's why she made my mother promise to raise you as her own. And your mother promised? She did. They even did this silly ritual, swapping rings and vowing to care for each other's children as their own. My mother was fully committed to that promise at the time. What changed? Asked Melissa. Richard sighed. Fear. When Emily passed and you were left alone, my mother panicked. She started imagining terrible scenarios. What if you didn't get along with me? What if there wasn't enough money to raise 2 children? What if Blackwell Construction went under for good? So she decided I was a problem that could be removed. Richard looked her in the eyes. Not removed. She truly believed you'd be better off with your aunt. She told herself it was better for you to grow up in a normal family without the complications of our situation. Melissa laughed bitterly. A normal family? My aunt barely tolerated me. I was just another mouth to feed in a house that was already tight. I grew up knowing I wasn't welcome, that I was there out of obligation. Richard lowered his head. When I got older and understood what had happened, I confronted my mother several times. She always said she'd done what was best for everyone involved, but I could see the guilt in her eyes. And you? Melissa asked. How did you feel knowing all this? Like my whole life was built on a lie, Richard admitted. Every success I achieved, every accomplishment, carried the weight of knowing it had come at your expense. That's why I could never truly be happy, even with all the money and success. Melissa studied Richard's face, seeing for the first time the deep sadness Dorothy had mentioned. When did you find out where I worked? 5 years ago, when I hired another detective. This time, he was more efficient and discovered your job at the Monarch. I went there, saw you waiting tables, and knew immediately it was you. And you decided watching me from afar was enough. Richard shook his head. I tried so many times to gather the courage to speak to you. I'd get to the table, you'd come over to take my order, and I'd freeze. How do you start a conversation like that? Hi, Melissa, remember me? I'm the son of the woman who broke the promise made to your mother? Maybe just like that, Melissa said. At least it would have been honest. You're right. I was a coward. I preferred this strange arrangement where I'd go there every week, watch you working, sometimes even chat about the menu, but I never had the courage to say who I really was. Melissa suddenly remembered something. You always asked for table 15, why? Richard blushed slightly. Because from there, I could watch you better without being obvious, and because it was near the window, so if I got too nervous, I could pretend I was looking at the street. 5 years, Melissa murmured. 5 years of this charade. It wasn't a charade for me, Richard said seriously. It was the only way I found to be near you without facing the truth. I know it was selfish, but those weekly visits were the only times I felt any peace. Why? Because seeing you doing well, working, surviving despite everything, it confirmed that you were as strong as your mother, that somehow you were making it, even without the help you should have had. Melissa was silent for a few minutes, stirring her now cold coffee. Richard respected her quiet, lost in his own thoughts. Finally, she spoke. I need to know more about my mother. You said you remembered me as a child, so you must remember her too. Richard's face brightened. Emily was an incredible person. She had this way of making any room brighter just by being there. You're a lot like her, you know. How so? The way you care for others. Emily was always looking out for everyone. If someone in the house was upset, she was the first to notice and try to help. You do the same thing at the restaurant, haven't you noticed? Melissa thought about the times she'd comforted co-workers or customers who seemed down. She'd never realized that might be something she'd inherited from her mother. Tell me more, she asked. Richard smiled at the memory. Emily sang while she worked. She had a beautiful voice, a bit husky, and knew every song on the radio. Do you sing too? Sometimes in the shower. People always say I have a nice voice, but I never took it seriously. You should. Emily always dreamed of being a singer when she was young. She said if she hadn't gotten pregnant so early, she might have tried for a career in music. Melissa felt a pang of sadness. Did she give up her dreams because of me? Richard shook his head firmly. No, I never saw Emily complain or show regret. On the contrary, you were the joy of her life. She always said having you was the best thing she ever did. And my father? I never knew anything about him. Richard hesitated. I think Emily would have told you herself if she were here. I don't feel it's my place to... Please, Melissa interrupted. They've already hidden so much from me. Don't hide anything else. Richard took a deep breath. Your father was a very young man, from a wealthy family that didn't approve of the relationship. When Emily got pregnant, he wanted to take responsibility, but his family forbade it. They offered her money to disappear, but she refused. Did he ever meet me? Richard nodded. For a few months, he came secretly to visit you and Emily, but the family pressure was too much, and in the end, he gave in. He took a job in another city and never came back. Melissa absorbed the information in silence. Is he alive? I believe so. Emily received a few letters from him over the years, always with the same message, that he was sorry, but he couldn't stand up to his family, that he hoped one day you'd understand. Melissa laughed bitterly. Understand what? That being rich was more important than being a father. Richard didn't answer, but his expression showed he agreed with her. Let's go back to your mother. Melissa said. Did she suffer a lot? Richard seemed to weigh his words carefully. Physically, yes. Her heart condition got worse over time, but emotionally, she was at peace. In her last months, she was obsessed with making sure everything was arranged for your future. How so? Emily spent all her savings hiring lawyers to ensure you'd be legally adopted by my mother. She wanted you to have all the rights of a daughter, not just basic care. Melissa straightened in her chair. Legally adopted? So I should be the legal daughter of my mother, Richard finished, with rights to inheritance, education, everything. Emily left nothing to chance. But that never happened. Richard lowered his head again. My mother tore up the adoption papers after Emily passed. She said it was too complicated, that it could cause legal trouble later. Melissa felt the anger rise again. So not only did she break her promise to take care of me, but she also stole a legal adoption from me. Richard nodded miserably. It's worse than that. There's more you need to know. What else? Melissa asked, bracing for another shock. Richard glanced around the cafe as if making sure no one was listening. Emily left an inheritance for you. An inheritance? What kind of inheritance? Not much money, because she didn't have much. But there were some family jewels she kept, some savings, and mainly a piece of land she inherited from her parents upstate. Melissa leaned forward. And where is all of that? With my mother, Richard admitted. She said she'd hold on to it until you grew up and came looking for your rights. But since you never came, because no one told me I had rights, Melissa exploded, drawing looks from other customers. How could I look for something I didn't know existed? Richard raised his hands in a calming gesture. You have every right to be furious. It was one injustice after another. Melissa forced herself to calm down. Tell me about this inheritance. The land is in Woodstock, about 5,000 square feet with a small house. Emily had inherited from her parents and always planned to build a bigger house there when you grew up. Melissa tried to imagine the life she could have had, a home in the countryside, far from the harshness of the city, maybe even a loving, present family. The jewelry is limited, but some pieces hold significant sentimental value, Richard continued, and there was about $10,000 saved, which adjusted for inflation today would be much more. $10,000 in 1983 was a lot of money, said Melissa. It was. Emily worked for years to save that amount to ensure you had a secure future. Melissa fell silent for a long moment. Richard respected her time, sipping his coffee and watching the street activity through the window. Finally, she spoke. I want to see these things. Richard nodded immediately. Of course, we can go right now if you'd like. Melissa eyed him suspiciously. Why are you being so helpful now? For 40 years, you didn't lift a finger to give me what was rightfully mine. Richard sighed. Because I can't live with this guilt anymore. Because every night I wake up thinking about how different your life could have been. Because I want, in some way, to try to fix the unfixable. You can't fix 40 years of abandonment and lies, Melissa said bluntly. I know, but I can try to make the next years different. Melissa studied his face, searching for signs of sincerity. How can I trust you? How do I know you won't let me down again? Richard met her gaze. You don't. You'll have to decide whether to give me a chance to prove I've changed, or if you'd rather I leave your life forever. The offer caught Melissa off guard. You'd do that? Disappear if I asked. Richard nodded slowly. If you feel my presence causes more pain than good, yes. You've already suffered enough because of us. Melissa considered the possibility. Part of her did want him to vanish, to take all the painful memories he'd unearthed with him, but another part, one she tried to ignore, was curious about where this reconciliation might lead. I want to see my inheritance, she finally said, but this doesn't mean I forgive you or that we'll be a happy family. It just means I want back what's rightfully mine. Richard nodded respectfully. Understood. Shall we? They returned to the nursing home, where Margaret waited anxiously. When she saw the two enter together, she sighed in relief. Melissa approached the bed. You said you kept my mother's things? Margaret nodded, pointing to a large cabinet in the corner of the room. Everything's there, in a blue box on the top shelf. Richard, could you get it for her? Richard brought over a light blue painted wooden box, clearly old but well preserved. Margaret motioned for him to hand it directly to Melissa. With trembling hands, Melissa opened the box. The scent that wafted out made her close her eyes involuntarily. It was a sweet, familiar fragrance that stirred memories she didn't even know she had. Inside the box was a red velvet jewelry case, some folded documents, photographs, and a small fabric pouch. Melissa opened the jewelry case first. There was a strand of small pearls, gold earrings with tiny diamonds, a delicate bracelet, and 2 rings besides the sapphire ring she already knew. "These were your grandmother's jewels," Margaret explained. "Emily asked me to keep them for when you married." Melissa held the pearl necklace up to the light. It was simple but elegant, clearly made with care. "Now the documents," Richard said, pointing to the papers. Melissa carefully unfolded them. There was the deed to the land in Woodstock, some investment certificates, and a bank letter confirming a savings account. Richard looked over her shoulder. "Melissa, these investments, with inflation adjustments and compound interest over 40 years, they must be worth a fortune today." Margaret stirred in bed. "I never had the courage to check how much they'd grown. I always had the bank automatically renew the investments." Melissa looked at the original amounts. Even for a layperson like her, it was obvious that 40 years of investments could have turned into a significant sum. Finally, she opened the fabric bag. Inside were more photos, these more intimate. Emily holding baby Melissa, the two playing in the park. Emily teaching Melissa to walk. Melissa paused at one specific photo. In it, Emily was embracing Margaret, both smiling radiantly. On each of their laps was a child, Melissa with Emily, Richard with Margaret. "Look at the date on the back," Margaret suggested. Melissa turned the photo over. "March 1983. Our families together forever." Below it were 2 signatures, Emily and Margaret. Melissa felt the tears return. "You two were really close." "Like sisters," Margaret confessed. "That's why it hurts so much to know I betrayed not just a promise, but a true friendship." Melissa kept sifting through the photos until she found one that made her freeze. It was Richard, maybe 12 years old, holding little Melissa's hand. Both were smiling at the camera, standing in front of what looked like an amusement park. Richard saw the photo and smiled nostalgically. "I remember that day. My mom had decided to take us for a fun day together. You were scared of the Ferris wheel, and I promised I'd stay by your side the whole time." Melissa studied the photo, trying to spark memories. "There's something familiar." "You cried when you had to leave at the end of the day," Richard continued. "Said you wanted to sleep over at our house so we could play the next day." Suddenly, a clear memory flashed in Melissa's mind. "I remember. You bought me cotton candy and said when I grew up you'd take me to see the beach." Richard smiled, his eyes brimming with tears. "You really remember. I remember you being kind to me. I remember feeling safe when I was near you," Melissa said, looking at him with a softer expression. Margaret watched the scene with a mix of joy and remorse. "You two were so close as children. I always thought you'd grow up together like siblings." "Why didn't that happen?" Melissa asked, looking straight at Margaret. The elderly woman took a deep breath, as if preparing for the hardest confession of her life. "Because I was afraid you'd become more important to Richard than I was. When Emily passed and you were left orphaned, I saw how protective Richard was of you, how much he cared. I was afraid of losing my son to a child who wasn't even mine." Richard looked at his mother in shock. "Mom, how could you say that? I was just a child too." "You were, but a child who already had too big a heart. You would have given everything to take care of Melissa, and I was afraid it would hurt your own growth." Melissa shook her head in disbelief. "So you pushed me away to protect your son from being too kind?" Margaret lowered her head, ashamed. "When you put it that way, it sounds so foolish, but at the time it felt like the right decision. I was desperate, scared, trying to raise a child alone and keep a business running." Richard stepped closer to his mother's bed. "Mom, don't you see? Pushing Melissa away didn't protect me from anything. It just made me grow up carrying terrible guilt and feeling incomplete." Margaret looked at her son in surprise. "Incomplete?" "Yes." My whole life, I felt like something was missing, like there was something that should have been there but wasn't. I only understood what it was when I saw Melissa at the restaurant. She was what was missing. The sister I should have had. The family we should have been. Melissa felt her heart tighten. Sister? Richard turned to her. I know biologically we're not siblings, but that's how I always felt. You were the most important person in my childhood after my mother. When you disappeared from my life, it was like a piece of me had been torn away. Melissa didn't know how to react to this revelation. Throughout the conversation, she had felt anger, sadness, confusion. But now, hearing Richard speak about feeling incomplete, she recognized something familiar. Me too, she murmured. I always felt like something was missing in my life, like there was a part of my story I didn't know. Margaret watched them with tears in her eyes. So I caused suffering for everyone. For Melissa, who lost a family. For Richard, who lost a sister. And for myself, who lived with this guilt for 40 years. Melissa walked to the window, gazing at the nursing home garden as she processed everything she'd discovered. Richard respected her silence, but Margaret couldn't hold back. Melissa, dear, I know I don't deserve it, but do you think you might ever forgive me? Melissa turned slowly. Mrs. Margaret, you stole 40 years of family from me. 40 years of having someone who cared for me, who supported me, who loved me unconditionally. How can I forgive that? Margaret nodded, crying. You're right. It's unforgivable. But, Melissa continued, I also see an 85-year-old woman who carried this guilt for decades, who suffered as much as I did, just in a different way. Richard looked at her with hope. Does that mean... It means I don't know yet, Melissa interrupted. I need time to process all this. I need to understand how I feel about you, about myself, about everything I learned today. Of course, Richard said immediately. We don't want to pressure you in any way. Melissa returned to the inheritance box and took out the last item she hadn't examined. It was a small, leather-bound notebook tied with a red ribbon. What's this? She asked. Margaret smiled for the first time since Melissa had arrived. It's Emily's diary. She wrote in it every night before bed. Melissa held the notebook reverently. May I read it? Of course, dear. Emily wrote a lot about you in there. Melissa untied the ribbon and opened the notebook to the first page. Her mother's delicate, familiar handwriting greeted her. January 1983. Melissa turned 8 today. She's growing up so fast it sometimes scares me. Margaret and I talked about our children, about how we want them to grow up close like siblings. Richard is so protective of Melissa, and she adores him. It makes me happy knowing that if anything happens to me, she'll have not just a substitute mother, but also a brother who loves her. Melissa stopped reading, too emotional to continue. Richard stepped closer. Do you want me to read with you? Or would you rather be alone? Melissa looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. No, I think I'd like you to read with me. After all, it seems you're an important part of this story too. Richard sat beside her, and together they began reading Emily's diary. Margaret watched from her bed, smiling through her tears. February 1983. The doctors confirmed today there's nothing more they can do. I have maybe 6 months if I'm lucky. I'm not afraid of leaving, but I'm terrified of leaving Melissa. I need to be sure she'll be safe and loved. Margaret promised she'll care for her as her own, and Richard already treats her like a little sister. That gives me peace. Melissa had to stop reading again, overwhelmed. Richard continued aloud. March 1983. Today we took the kids to the amusement park. Watching Richard and Melissa play together filled me with joy. They have a special connection, like they're truly siblings. Margaret and I joked that when they grow up, they'll stand by each other no matter what life throws their way. Margaret sobbed from her bed. How could I destroy something so beautiful? Richard continued reading. April 1983. I spoke with Margaret about the legal adoption. She agreed it's important for Melissa to have all the rights of a daughter. I also organized all the inheritance I managed to save. It's not much, but it will be enough to give her a more secure future. Margaret promised to keep everything until Melissa comes of age. Melissa looked at Margaret. You really agreed to all this? Margaret nodded miserably. I agreed to everything. I was sincerely committed to the promises I made to Emily. May 1983. I'm growing weaker, but Melissa is thriving. Yesterday she told me she wants to be just like Aunt Margaret when she grows up, taking care of people and making them happy. My heart swelled with pride. I know Margaret will be a wonderful mother to her. Melissa closed the diary and looked at Margaret. I really called you Aunt Margaret? Margaret smiled through her tears. You did. And you always said that when you grew up, you'd work with me at Blackwell Construction, looking after everyone. Richard turned a few more pages of the diary. There's one last entry here. He read aloud. June 1983. This will be my final entry. I feel my time is coming to an end, but I am at peace. Margaret and Richard have promised to care for my Melissa, and I know they will keep their word. Melissa, if you ever read this, know that you were the greatest joy of my life, and wherever I am, I will always watch over you. Be happy, my daughter. You deserve all the love in the world. Your mother, who loves you eternally, Emily. The silence that followed was deep and heavy with emotion. Melissa held the diary to her chest, crying quietly. Richard placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Margaret was the first to speak. Emily trusted me, like no one else ever has, and I failed in a way that is unforgivable. Melissa wiped her tears and looked at Margaret. Mrs. Margaret, may I ask you something? Of course, dear. If you could go back in time, would you do things differently? Margaret didn't hesitate for a second. Yes. 1,000 times yes. I would have held you on the day of Emily's funeral and never let go. I would have raised you as I promised, loved you as my own, and done everything to ensure you and Richard grew up as the siblings you were meant to be. Melissa studied the elderly woman's face, searching for signs of sincerity. And now? What do you want now? Margaret looked at her with hopeful eyes. I want a chance to make things right, even if it's too late. I want to know the incredible woman you've become despite everything. I want you to know that all these years, even though I failed you terribly, I still cared about you. How did you care? Melissa asked skeptically. Margaret turned to Richard. Son, tell her about the times I asked about Melissa. Richard seemed surprised. Mom, you never asked directly. Not directly, Margaret admitted. But whenever you mentioned seeing a young woman on the street who reminded you of someone, or when you talked about hiring that detective, I knew you were talking about her. And I always asked for details, always wanted to know if she was okay. Melissa looked from Margaret to Richard. Is that true? Richard nodded. I never realized it at the time, but yes. My mother always paid closer attention when I mentioned anything that might be related to you. Margaret continued. And when Richard started frequenting the monarch, I knew why. He never said it outright. But I knew my son. I knew he had found you. Why didn't you say anything? Richard asked. Because I was afraid of your reaction. Afraid you'd confront me about what I had done. Afraid I'd have to admit to myself that I had broken the most important promise of my life. Melissa stood and walked to the window again. Outside, she could see elderly residents strolling through the gardens, some accompanied by family, others alone. You two stole 40 years of family from me, she said without turning around. 40 years of love, support, security. 40 years of having people who cared about me. Margaret and Richard lowered their heads, bracing for more accusations. But, Melissa continued, still gazing out the window, I also see two people who suffered the consequences of their choices, who carried guilt and remorse for decades. She turned to face them. I can't say I forgive you because that would be a lie. I can't say we'll be a happy family because that doesn't happen overnight. Richard and Margaret waited in silence. But I can say I'm willing to try to understand, to really get to know you, to see if it's possible to build some kind of relationship from now on. Margaret began to cry with relief. Melissa, dear, that's more than I deserve. It's more than any of us deserve, Melissa said. But maybe it's what we need. Richard stood up. Melissa, what does this mean in practice? It means I want to know my real inheritance. I want to see the land in Woodstock. I want to understand the investments. I want to know exactly what my mother left for me." "Of course," Richard said immediately. "We can go tomorrow if you'd like. And it also means I want to get to know you. I want to see who you are today, not just who you were in the past. I want to understand how you got here, how you feel about all this." Margaret straightened up in bed. "You mean we can really get to know each other?" Melissa nodded slowly. "Let's take it slow. No pressure, no unrealistic expectations. Just let's see what happens." Richard smiled for the first time since Melissa had appeared. Can I invite you to dinner tomorrow? Nothing fancy, just a normal conversation." Melissa hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, but somewhere neutral. I'm not ready to go to your house yet." "Of course. How about the Monarch? It'd be a symbolic way to start fresh." Melissa laughed, her first genuine laugh since this whole situation began. "The Monarch? Where it all started?" "Exactly," Richard said, smiling too. "And this time, you'll be the guest, not the waitress." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers. Now, continuing. The dinner at the Monarch the next evening was unlike anything Melissa had ever experienced. For the first time, she was seated as a customer in the restaurant where she'd worked for 3 years. Richard arrived promptly at 8, wearing a more casual suit than usual. Melissa had chosen a simple but elegant dress, wearing the pearl necklace she'd inherited from her mother. "You look beautiful," Richard said as she approached the table. "The necklace suits you perfectly." "Thank you. It was strange picking out what to wear for dinner with you." Richard laughed. "For dinner with the man who should have been your brother, but who you knew as a customer and who's now trying to be—" "What exactly?" "Good question," Melissa said, sitting down. "I'm still figuring that out." The restaurant manager, the same one who had reprimanded Melissa days earlier, approached the table with a puzzled expression upon recognizing the former employee. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwell. And Melissa, I don't understand. Don't you work here anymore?" Richard intervened gently. "Melissa is my guest tonight, and while we're at it, I wanted to let you know she won't be returning to work here. She's found a better opportunity." The manager looked even more confused, but professionally accepted the news. "Very well. May I take your orders?" After the manager walked away, Melissa looked at Richard. "A better opportunity." Richard flushed slightly. "Well, technically it's not a lie. You've discovered you have a significant inheritance and are about to start a new chapter in your life." Melissa smiled. "Technically true, but not the whole truth. It's a skill I've developed over the years in business." "Tell me about the business," Melissa asked. "I want to understand how you built your life." Richard visibly relaxed, grateful for a less emotionally charged topic. "Blackwell Construction was nearly bankrupt when my father died. My mother fought hard to keep it running, but she didn't understand much about construction." "And you learned on your own?" Richard nodded. "I started working at the company when I was 14, after school. I learned from the bricklayers, foremen, engineers. By the time I finished high school, I knew the business inside out. It must have been hard growing up with so much responsibility. It was, but it also gave me purpose. Every project we completed, every family that could buy one of our homes, made me feel like I was building something important." Melissa studied his face. "Do you feel fulfilled?" Richard hesitated. "Professionally, yes. The company has grown a lot. We have an excellent reputation. We employ hundreds of people. But personally, I've always felt like something was missing." "Didn't your wife fill that void?" Richard's face darkened. "Barbara was a wonderful person. We married for genuine love, had some very happy years, but she always said I carried a sadness she couldn't understand or heal." Melissa leaned forward. "Did you ever tell her about me?" Richard shook his head. "How could I? Hi, honey. I let an orphaned girl be abandoned as a child and never did anything to help her. That's not the kind of thing you tell someone you love." "But did she sense something was bothering you?" Richard smiled sadly. "Barbara was very intuitive. She always said I had eyes of someone who lost someone important. I tried many times to open up, but I could never find the right words. And when she died, how did you handle it? Richard fell silent for a long moment, toying with his fork on the table. It was terrible. Losing Barbara made me realize how much time I'd wasted keeping secrets. In her last years, I was obsessed with finding you, and she knew something was eating at me. Melissa felt a pang of guilt. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for my existence to cause problems in your marriage. No, Richard hurried to clarify. It wasn't your existence that caused problems. It was my cowardice in not acting on it. If I'd had the courage to look for you years earlier, to tell Barbara the truth, maybe our last years together would have been fuller. Melissa absorbed this in silence. It was hard to accept that her absence had affected so many people in ways she'd never imagined. And your daughter? She asked. Richard had mentioned having a daughter in London. Jennifer, she's 32, an architect, and has lived in London for 5 years. We worked together at Blackwell Construction before she decided to pursue an international career. Are you close? Richard sighed. We were. But after Barbara's death, I shut down. Jennifer tried to help, but I was so lost in guilt and regret that I couldn't be the father she needed. Does she know about me? No. Just like with Barbara, I could never find a way to explain. How do you tell your daughter you had a sister who was abandoned? Melissa felt a strange curiosity about this niece she never knew existed. What's she like? Richard smiled genuinely for the first time in the conversation. Jennifer is amazing, smart, determined, with a strong sense of justice. I think you'd get along. Why? Because she's always had a soft spot for lost causes and people in need. Since she was little, she'd bring home injured animals, stand up for bullied classmates, organize donation drives at school. She sounds like a special person. She is. And I ruined our relationship because I couldn't deal with my own demons. Melissa studied Richard's expression. You really want to reconnect with her, don't you? Richard nodded. More than anything. But how do I explain years of distance? How do I tell her I was obsessed with a broken promise she doesn't even know existed? Maybe by telling the truth, Melissa suggested. People can be more understanding than we think. Richard looked at her with hopeful eyes. Do you think Jennifer would understand? I don't know her. I don't know. But I do know keeping secrets never made any situation better. The waiter brought their main courses, briefly interrupting the conversation. When they were alone again, Melissa was the one who spoke first. Richard, can I ask you a personal question? Of course. Why did you never remarry? 5 years is enough time to start a new life. Richard laughed dryly. Because how do you open up to someone new when you're carrying so many secrets? How do you build intimacy when there are parts of your life you can't even explain to yourself? Melissa understood perfectly. I've never been able to keep a serious relationship either. Why? Melissa hesitated, then decided to be honest. Because I always felt like something was broken inside me, like there was a fundamental part of my personality missing. Men could tell I was always searching for something, but they didn't know what. Richard looked at her intently. And now, do you still feel like something's missing? Melissa considered the question carefully. I'm still processing everything, but for the first time in my life, I feel like the puzzle pieces are starting to fit together. Richard smiled. I feel the same way. They ate in silence for a few minutes, each lost in thought. Finally, Melissa spoke again. Richard, what do you hope will come of all this? This reconnection? Richard set down his fork and looked her straight in the eyes. Honestly, I don't know. Part of me hopes we can recover some of the connection we had as kids. Another part just wants to make sure you're okay and have everything you need to be happy. And if we can't have a close relationship, what if it's too late for that? Richard considered the question seriously. Then at least I'll know I tried, that I did everything I could to fix what was broken, and you'll have back what was always rightfully yours. Melissa appreciated his honesty. Thank you for not setting unrealistic expectations. Richard smiled. 40 years has taught me life rarely goes according to plan. Speaking of plans, Melissa said, I want to see the land in Woodstock tomorrow. Can you take me? Of course. What time works for you? Early morning. I want to see the place where my mother dreamed of building a life for us. Richard nodded. I'll pick you up at 9 if that's all right. That's fine. And Richard? Yes? Thank you for letting me do this at my own pace. I know you must be eager to sort everything out at once. Richard smiled understandingly. Melissa, I waited 40 years to learn the truth. I can wait however long you need to decide what to do with it. After dinner, Richard walked her to the bus stop, insisting on waiting with her until it arrived. You don't have to wait, Melissa said. I can take care of myself. I know you can. But I'm still trying to figure out how to fit you into my life. Letting you leave alone doesn't feel right. Melissa studied his face under the streetlight. You really do feel like I'm family, don't you? Richard nodded without hesitation. I always have. Even when I didn't know where you were or how you were doing, there was always this feeling that someone important was missing from my life. It's strange, Melissa admitted. I should be angrier at you. I should feel like strangers. But there's something familiar about being near you. It was as if my subconscious remembered something my conscious mind had forgotten. The bus arrived, interrupting the moment. Melissa climbed the steps, then turned to Richard. See you tomorrow at 9. See you tomorrow, Richard replied. And Melissa? Yes? Thank you for giving me this chance. Melissa waved and sat near the window. As the bus pulled away, she saw Richard still standing at the stop, watching the vehicle disappear. During the entire ride home, Melissa reflected on their conversation. It was impossible to deny there was a real connection between her and Richard, not just the shared past she'd forgotten, but something present, current. When she got home, she found her roommates watching TV in the living room. Melissa, said Jessica, one of her roommates. How was the mysterious meeting? Melissa had only told her friends she had family matters to resolve, without going into details. Complicated, she replied. I found out some things about my family I didn't know. Good things? Asked Stephanie, the other roommate. Melissa considered the question. I don't know yet. I think I'll figure it out little by little. In her room, Melissa opened the keepsake box Richard had insisted she take home. She reread parts of her mother's diary, trying to connect the written words with the few memories she could recover. One specific entry caught her attention. Melissa asked me today if Richard would be her brother forever. I told her yes, that some connections are eternal, even when people aren't physically together. She was happy with the answer and said she'd keep Richard in her heart, even if she had to go far away. Melissa closed the diary and looked up at the ceiling of her small room. Had her child's heart really kept Richard there all these years? Was that why she always felt incomplete, as if searching for someone without knowing who? The next morning, Richard arrived promptly at 9. Melissa had chosen casual but thoughtful clothes, feeling a mix of anxiety and curiosity about what she'd find in Woodstock. Ready? Richard asked when she got in the car. As ready as I can be to see the place where my life should have happened. Richard drove in silence for the first few minutes, letting Melissa take in the cityscape giving way to the countryside. Finally, he spoke. Melissa, I need to tell you something before we get there. What? I visited the property a few times over the years. I never went inside the house, but I walked the grounds. I wanted to make sure it was being well kept. Why? Richard sighed. Because I always thought one day you'd show up to claim what was yours. I wanted it to be in good condition when that happened. You always believed I'd come back. Richard nodded. I had to believe it. It was the only way to live with the guilt. They drove another hour before reaching Woodstock. Richard took a dirt road leading to a more secluded area, surrounded by hills and woods. Here we are, he said, stopping in front of a simple but well-kept wooden gate. Melissa got out of the car and looked around. It was a beautiful, peaceful place, exactly the kind of environment where a child could grow up happy and safe. Richard opened the gate, and they walked along a stone path toward the house. It was a small but charming structure, with exposed brick walls and a red tile roof. Your mother inherited this from her parents, Richard explained. They had a small coffee farm here. After they passed, Emily kept the property as a weekend home. Melissa approached the house and peered through the windows. The furniture was covered in sheets, but she could tell it had been a cozy space. "Do you have the key?" she asked. Richard pulled a set of keys from his pocket. "My mother gave them to me before you showed up. She said that if I ever found you, I should bring you here." They entered the house together. Despite the years of neglect, it was clear this had once been a place filled with love. The living room was small but cozy, with a stone fireplace and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. Melissa walked slowly through the rooms. There were 2 small bedrooms, a simple but functional kitchen, and a basic bathroom. Everything was clean and tidy. Clearly, Richard had hired someone to maintain the house. In the larger bedroom, Melissa found a framed photo on the dresser. It showed Emily as a young woman, smiling at the camera in front of the very same house. "She really loved this place," Richard said, appearing in the doorway. "I can feel it," Melissa replied. "There's a good energy here." They stepped outside to explore the property. There was a small overgrown garden, a few fruit trees, and an artesian well. At the back of the land, a breathtaking view of the surrounding mountains stretched before them. Melissa sat on a large rock near the property line, taking in the scenery. "It's beautiful here," she said. "My mother had good taste." Richard sat beside her. "Emily always talked about building a bigger house here when you grew up. She wanted to make a studio where she could teach you to sing." Melissa smiled sadly. "Did she really believe she'd live long enough to see me grow up?" Richard hesitated before answering. "I think she hoped she'd have more time. In her last months, when the illness got worse, she focused on making sure you'd be taken care of. But yes, she dreamed of a future here with you." Melissa fell silent for a long moment, imagining what it might have been like to grow up in this place, running through the fields, helping in the garden, maybe even learning to sing as her mother had dreamed. "Richard," she finally said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "If your mother had kept her promise, if she had adopted me, do you think we would have been happy? Growing up together, being a real family?" Richard considered the question carefully. "Honestly, I think so. You always brought lightness into my life, even when we were kids. And I always liked looking after you, being the protective older brother." Melissa glanced at him. "Do you miss that version of yourself? The protective boy you used to be?" Richard smiled wistfully. "Every day. I think part of why I've been unhappy all these years is because I lost that part of me. When you disappeared from my life, I lost the chance to be an older brother, to have someone to protect and care for." "That's interesting," Melissa said. "I've always struggled to trust people, to let myself be taken care of. Maybe because I lost the experience of having someone who genuinely cared about me so early." Richard turned to her. Can I try to take care of you now? Not to make up for the past, but as the family we are." Melissa studied his face, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "I don't know how I feel about that yet, but I can say your presence gives me a sense of security I haven't felt in a long time." Richard smiled. "That's a start." They spent another 2 hours exploring the property. Richard showed Melissa where Emily had planned to build the bigger house, where she wanted to plant a flower garden, where she dreamed of making a small artificial pond. By the time they returned to the city, Melissa was filled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she was furious at being robbed of the idyllic life her mother had planned. On the other, she felt a deep connection to Richard that she couldn't ignore. "Richard," she said when they reached her neighborhood, "I need time to process all this. Can you give me a few days?" "Of course. Take all the time you need." Melissa hesitated before getting out of the car. "Can I keep the keys to the house? I'd like to go back alone, spend some time trying to feel my mother's presence." Richard handed over the keys without hesitation. "The house is yours, Melissa. It always has been." In the days that followed, Melissa took time off work and spent hours driving to Woodstock. She would sit in different corners of the property, reading her mother's diary and trying to imagine what her life there might have been like. During one of these visits, she decided to explore the house more thoroughly. In the small attic, she found more boxes with Emily's belongings, old clothes, more photos, and surprisingly some cassette tapes. Curious, she took the tapes back to the city, and borrowed an old player from a neighbor. The first tape she listened to made her break down in tears. It was Emily's voice singing lullabies, clearly recorded for Melissa. Between the songs, Emily spoke directly to her daughter. "My little Melissa, if you're ever listening to this and I'm no longer here, I want you to know you were the greatest gift life ever gave me. These songs are for you to carry in your heart whenever you feel alone. Remember that Mommy's love will always be with you, no matter where you are." Melissa listened to all the tapes over and over, feeling for the first time a real connection to the mother she barely remembered. Emily's tender, loving voice finally made her understand what she had lost. On the 5th day after visiting the property, Melissa called Richard. "Can I see you? I have some things to tell you." "Of course, where would you like to meet?" "At the house in Woodstock. I want to show you what I found." Richard arrived at the property late in the afternoon. He found Melissa sitting on the porch, the cassette player beside her. "Did you find something?" he asked, sitting next to her. "My mother," Melissa answered simply. "I found my real mother." She showed Richard the tapes and played one for him. When Emily's voice filled the air, Richard closed his eyes, visibly moved. "I remembered her voice," he said when the song ended, "but I'd forgotten how warm it was." "Richard," Melissa said after listening to the tapes and spending these days here, "I need to tell you how I feel." Richard braced himself for anything. "I'm still very angry. Angry at your mother, angry at the circumstances, angry at the lost time. But I'm also starting to understand that carrying this anger for the rest of my life won't give me back the years I lost." Richard nodded, waiting for her to continue. "And there's something else. When I'm here, in this place where my mother dreamed of building our life, I feel a very strong connection to you. Like part of my soul actually remembers having an older brother who looked after me." Richard's eyes filled with tears. "So, I want to propose something," Melissa went on. "I want us to try building a real relationship, not based on guilt or regret, but on what we truly feel for each other now." Richard couldn't speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, he said, "Melissa, that's all I've wanted to hear." "But there are conditions," she said, raising her hand. "What are they?" "First, complete transparency. No more secrets, no more half-truths. If we're going to have a relationship, it has to be based on total honesty." Richard nodded immediately. "I completely agree. Second, I want you to help me understand the full financial situation of my inheritance. I need to know exactly what I'm entitled to and how it works. Of course, we can go to the bank tomorrow if you'd like. Third, I want to meet your daughter. If we're going to be family, she needs to know I exist." Richard hesitated. "Melissa, I don't know how she'll react." "That's why we'll tell her together," Melissa interrupted. "You won't face this alone, and I want to meet my niece." Richard smiled through his tears. "Are you sure?" "I am. My mother made it clear in those tapes that family is the most important thing in the world. I won't waste any more time pretending we don't have a special connection." Richard stood up and embraced Melissa, both crying with relief and joy. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me a second chance to be your brother." "Thank you for never giving up on looking for me," she replied. When they pulled apart, Richard wiped his tears and smiled. "So where do we begin?" Melissa smiled back. "How about we call your daughter right now? I'm so curious to meet Jennifer." Richard pulled out his phone, but hesitated before dialing. "What if she's angry with me for hiding this?" Melissa placed her hand on his arm. "Then we'll handle it together. After all, that's how families work, isn't it?" Richard smiled and dialed the number. As he waited for Jennifer to answer, he looked at Melissa and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me how to be family again." The call connected, and a cheerful female voice came through. "Hi, Dad. What a surprise. How are you?" Richard took a deep breath. "Jennifer, sweetheart, I'm good. Better than I've been in years, actually, but I need to tell you something very important. Something I should have told you a long time ago." There was a pause on the other end. "Dad, you're scaring me. Did something happen?" Richard looked at Melissa, who nodded encouragingly. "No, honey. Actually, something wonderful happened. I found out that you have an aunt. An aunt I should have introduced you to years ago." The silence on the other end was long. Finally, Jennifer spoke. "Dad, I think you'd better explain this in person. I'm catching the first flight to New York tomorrow." Richard smiled. "That would be great, sweetheart. We have a lot to talk about." "And Dad?" "Yes? I'm glad you called. I've missed you." After hanging up, Richard looked at Melissa with a mix of relief and nervousness. "Well," he said, "looks like you'll meet your niece tomorrow." Melissa smiled. "I can't wait." They spent the rest of the afternoon at the estate, planning how they would tell the whole story to Jennifer. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, they sat on the porch to watch the spectacle. "Richard," Melissa said softly, "can I ask you one more question?" "Of course. Do you think our mother, that Emily, would be happy to know we found each other?" Richard smiled, gazing at the sky now painted in orange and pink. "I think she is happy, Melissa. I think somehow she knew this would happen, that the love she planted between us was too strong to be destroyed forever." Melissa nodded, feeling a peace she hadn't known in decades. "Then let's start living the life she dreamed for us, even if it's 40 years late." Richard reached out his hand, and Melissa took it without hesitation. "Better late than never, little sister." For the first time in 40 years, Melissa smiled at being called little sister. Better late than never, Richie. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. Jennifer's arrival the next day brought new energy to the situation. She was a feminine version of Richard, the same expressive eyes, the same elegant bearing, but with a fierce determination that reminded them of Emily. Richard and Melissa went to pick her up at the airport together. Jennifer stepped off the plane looking for her father and stopped abruptly when she saw an unfamiliar woman beside him. "Dad?" she said, approaching cautiously. "Jennifer, this is Melissa. Melissa Parker, your aunt." Jennifer looked from Richard to Melissa, clearly trying to process the information. "Aunt, Dad, what are you talking about? You don't have any siblings." Richard sighed. "It's a long story, sweetheart. How about we go home and talk it through properly?" On the way to Richard's house, Jennifer bombarded her father with questions that he skillfully dodged, saying he would explain everything when they arrived. Richard's house was exactly what Melissa expected. Large, elegant, but curiously devoid of warmth. It felt like a space that had once been happy, but was now merely functional. Sitting in the living room, Richard began to tell Jennifer the whole story. He spoke about Emily, the broken promise, about Margaret, about 40 years of guilt and searching. Jennifer listened in silence, her expression shifting through various emotions: shock, confusion, anger, and finally, understanding. "Dad," she said when Richard finished, "are you telling me that my whole life I had an aunt who was struggling here in New York and you knew where she was?" Richard lowered his head. "For the last 5 years, yes." "And you never thought to tell me? Never thought I'd want to know my own family?" Jennifer's voice grew louder, and Melissa decided to step in. "Jennifer, can I say something?" The young woman turned to her, eyes still blazing with indignation. "Your father carried a terrible guilt for decades. He tried to help me in the ways he could, even if it wasn't enough. And now he's trying to do the right thing, even knowing he might lose you in the process." Jennifer studied Melissa's face. "And you? How do you feel about all this?" Melissa sighed. "Angry, sad, confused, but also grateful to finally know the truth, and curious to meet the niece I never knew I had." Jennifer stood and walked to the window, gazing at the garden outside. After a few minutes of silence, she turned back to them. "Dad, I'm angry at you for keeping this from me, but I'm also trying to understand why it was so hard for you to deal with." Richard looked at his daughter with hope. "And Melissa," Jennifer continued, "I don't know yet how I feel about having an aunt who appeared out of nowhere, but I want to get to know you better. I want to understand who you are, not just where you came from." Melissa smiled. "That's all I can ask for." Jennifer returned to the sofa. "Then let's start from the beginning. Melissa, tell me about your life, who you are, what you like to do, what your dreams are." For the next 3 hours, Melissa shared her story with Jennifer. She spoke about her difficult childhood, the jobs she took to survive, the struggles to maintain relationships, but also about her strength, determination, and small triumphs. Jennifer listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and showing genuine curiosity about her aunt's life. "You never married?" she asked at one point. "No, I could never fully trust someone. I always felt like a part of me was missing, that I couldn't offer a complete relationship until I knew who I really was." "And now? Now that you do?" Melissa looked at Richard and then at Jennifer. "Now I feel like I can finally start living for real, like I have a solid foundation of who I am and where I come from." Jennifer turned to her father. "And you, Dad? How do you plan to deal with 40 years of remorse?" Richard thought carefully before answering. "I can't change the past, Jennifer, but I can try to make the future different. I can be the brother I should have been to Melissa and the father I should have been to you." Jennifer studied her father's face. "Does that mean you'll stop carrying that sadness I've always sensed in you?" Richard looked at Melissa. "I think so. For the first time in decades, I feel like I can truly be happy." Jennifer smiled for the first time since arriving. "Then, I guess I have to thank Melissa. You brought my father back." Melissa blushed. "I think we brought each other back." The three of them talked late into the night. Jennifer shared about her life in London, her architecture projects, her struggles to understand her father's constant melancholy. "Now it all makes sense," she said. "You always had this air about you, like you were searching for something. I used to think it was longing for Mom, but it was more than that, wasn't it?" Richard nodded. "It was like there was a hole in my soul I couldn't explain or fill." "And now?" Jennifer asked. Richard looked at Melissa and smiled. "Now I feel whole again." Jennifer stood up and hugged her father. "Dad, I'm still processing all of this, but I'm happy you found the courage to tell the truth." Then she turned to Melissa. "And you, Aunt Melissa, can I call you that?" Melissa smiled with tears in her eyes. "Please do. Aunt Melissa, I want you to know that now that you've come into our lives, we won't let you go ever again." Melissa was moved. "Thank you, Jennifer. You don't know how good it feels to finally have a family." "You always had a family," Richard said. "It just took 40 years for us to find each other again." In the days that followed, the three of them spent a lot of time together. Jennifer cancelled her commitments in London for a week to get to know Melissa better. They went to the bank together to check on Emily's inheritance. The investments, as Richard had predicted, had grown significantly over the years. Melissa discovered she was entitled to a sum that would make her financially independent for the rest of her life. They also visited the property in Woodstock together. Jennifer, as an architect, was enchanted by the land and immediately began making suggestions about how Emily would have expanded the house. "Have you thought about moving here?" Jennifer asked as they walked around the property. Melissa looked at the small, cozy house. "It's tempting, but it's also scary. I've spent my whole life in the city. I don't know what it'd be like to live in the countryside." Jennifer smiled. "What if I designed a renovation for you? I could keep the original charm but make the house more comfortable and functional. You'd do that?" "Of course. It'd be my welcome back gift to the family." Richard, who had been quietly watching their interaction, smiled. "It's amazing to see you two connecting so quickly." Melissa looked at him. "I think real families have that ability. The connection was always there, it just needed to be rediscovered." During the week, Jennifer also took Melissa to see other aspects of the family's life. They visited Richard's construction company together, where Melissa saw the empire he had built. "Dad's always been a workaholic," Jennifer explained as they walked through the office. "I think work was his way of not thinking about other things." Richard, who was guiding their tour, confirmed, "Work was my escape. The busier I was, the less time I had to think about what I'd lost." "And now?" Melissa asked. "Are you still going to use work as an escape?" Richard shook his head. "Now I have reasons to want to be present in real life. I have a sister to get to know and a daughter to reconnect with." Jennifer smiled and hugged her father. "I missed you too, Dad. Even living far away, I always felt you were emotionally distant." "That's going to change," Richard promised. "From now on, family comes first." At the end of the week, the three of them made one last visit to St. Clair Nursing Home to see Margaret. The elderly woman had visibly improved since Melissa had come into her life. Jennifer approached her grandmother's bed with a serious expression. "Grandma, I heard about what you did. About the promise you broke." Margaret lowered her head, ashamed. "Jennifer, dear, I know I must seem like a terrible person to you now." Jennifer sat in the chair beside the bed. "Grandma, I'm trying to understand. You always taught me about the importance of keeping promises and taking care of family. How could you abandon a child who should have been like a daughter?" Margaret began to cry. "Because I was afraid, Jennifer. Afraid I wouldn't have enough resources. Afraid I wouldn't know how to raise 2 children. Afraid that caring for Melissa would hurt your father's future. And now, how do you feel about those choices?" Margaret looked at Melissa, who was standing beside Richard Blackwell. "Now I see the incredible woman Melissa became despite everything I put her through, and I wonder how different it might have been if I'd had the courage to keep my promise." Jennifer held her grandmother's hand. "Grandma, we all make mistakes. What matters is trying to fix them while there's still time." Margaret looked hopefully at her granddaughter. "Do you think there's still time?" Jennifer glanced at Melissa. "Aunt Melissa, the decision is yours. Can you forgive my grandmother?" Melissa walked to the bed and sat on the other side. "Mrs. Margaret, I can't say I completely forgive you, because it still hurts too much to think about everything I lost, but I can say I understand your choices, even if I don't agree with them." Margaret squeezed Melissa's hand. "That's more than I deserve. And I can also say I don't want to spend the rest of my life carrying anger and resentment. I want to use the time we have left to build something new." Margaret smiled through her tears. "Melissa, dear, you're far more generous than I ever was." Richard stepped closer to them. "Mum, Melissa is giving us a second chance. Let's make it count." Margaret nodded. "I'll do everything in my power to make it right." Jennifer stood up. "Grandma, Aunt Melissa, Dad, how about we start a new family tradition? Sunday dinners where we all gather to talk, laugh, and just be together." Richard smiled. "I'd love that." Melissa nodded. "It would be wonderful." Margaret brightened. "And I could tell you stories about Emily. I have so many memories of her I've never shared." The following Sunday, they gathered at Richard's house for their first family dinner. Jennifer had cooked, Richard had set the table, and Melissa had brought flowers from the garden in Woodstock. Margaret had been allowed to leave St. Clair Nursing Home for a few hours to join them. She was in a wheelchair, but her eyes sparkled with joy. During dinner, Margaret shared stories about Emily that even Richard hadn't known. She spoke of her friend's dreams, her hopes for Melissa, and her plans for a future that never came. "Emily always said family isn't just about blood," Margaret told them. "It's about choice, about choosing to love and care for each other, even when it's hard." Melissa smiled. "Seems she was right." Richard raised his wine glass. "I'd like to make a toast." Everyone lifted their glasses. "To Emily, who planted the love that brought us back together, to second chances, and to the family that finally found its way home." "To family," they all echoed. After dinner, they settled in the living room. Jennifer had brought her laptop and began showing the designs she'd made for renovating the house in Woodstock. Melissa was impressed with the drawings. Jennifer had managed to preserve the rustic charm of the property while creating more spacious and comfortable areas. "It's perfect," Melissa said. "Your mother would be proud." Richard leaned in to see the designs better. "Jennifer, this is amazing. When can we start construction?" Melissa looked at him in surprise. "You're offering to fund the renovation?" Richard smiled. "Melissa, you have your own money now, but I'd like to contribute as a family gift, a way to start making up for lost time." Melissa considered the offer. "Richard, that's very generous, but I'd rather use my own money. I need to do this for myself." Richard nodded respectfully. "I completely understand, but at least let me help with the labor." "The construction company can do the work at no cost," Melissa smiled. "That, I'll accept. After all, this is how families help each other, right?" Jennifer clapped her hands. "Then it's settled. I'll finalize the plans this week and we can start the renovation next month. Margaret, who had been quietly observing the interaction, spoke with emotion in her voice. Emily would be so happy seeing you all plan a life in the home she loved so much. Melissa walked over to Margaret's wheelchair. Mrs. Margaret, I'd like you to come live with me in Woodstock when the house is ready. Margaret looked at her in shock. Melissa, dear, that's so generous, but it's not generosity, Melissa interrupted. It's necessity. I spent 40 years without family. Now that I have one, I don't want to waste a single minute. Richard was moved. Melissa, that would be amazing. Mom would love being close to nature again. Jennifer smiled. And I could design a bedroom on the ground floor, specially adapted for Grandma. Margaret began to cry. Have you all really forgiven me? Melissa took her hand. Mrs. Margaret, forgiveness is a process, but I can say I choose love over anger. I choose to build rather than destroy. Richard stepped closer and hugged his mother and sister. Thank you, Melissa, for giving us a chance to be a real family. In the weeks that followed, the renovation of the house in Woodstock became a family project. Jennifer stayed longer in the US to oversee the work. Richard visited the site regularly, offering suggestions and ensuring everything was done perfectly. Melissa also spent a lot of time on the property, sometimes just sitting in the garden, imagining her mother in the same places 40 years earlier. During one of these visits, Richard found her quietly crying near the well. Melissa, are you okay? She wiped her tears. I was thinking about my mother, about how much she must have suffered, knowing she'd leave me alone. Richard sat beside her on the grass. Emily didn't leave you alone, Melissa. She left you with people who promised to care for you. The fact that we failed doesn't mean she didn't do everything right. Melissa looked at him. Do you think she'd forgive us for taking so long to find each other? Richard smiled. I think she's happy now, seeing that we finally understand what she wanted to teach us. What did she want to teach us? That family is about unconditional love, about forgiveness, about second chances, and about never giving up on the people we love. Melissa nodded, feeling a deep peace. Then let's honor her memory by living those values. 3 months later, the house was ready. Jennifer had created a beautiful, functional space, keeping its original charm while adding modern comforts. On moving day, the whole family was there. Richard had brought Margaret from the nursing home, Jennifer had arranged the furniture, and Melissa was finally settling into the place her mother had dreamed she would live. That evening, they gathered on the porch to watch the sunset. Margaret was comfortably seated in her wheelchair, Jennifer was showing photos of the renovation to friends in London, Richard was checking work emails, and Melissa was simply soaking in the peace of the moment. Melissa, Margaret said, can I ask you something? Of course, are you happy here? Melissa looked around at her gathered family, the beautiful house, the serene landscape. For the first time in my life, I can say yes. I'm genuinely happy. Richard smiled. Emily would be proud of you. I think she'd be proud of all of us, Melissa replied, for finding our way back to each other. Jennifer raised her glass of juice. I'd like to make a toast. Everyone looked at her expectantly. To the sapphire ring that brought us all together, to the courage to face the past, and to the future we'll build together as a family. To the future, they all repeated. As the sun set behind the mountains, Melissa took the sapphire ring she always carried around her neck and slipped it onto her finger, for the first time since discovering the truth. What are you doing? Richard asked. I'm honoring the promise our mothers made 40 years ago, she replied. The promise that we'd be family forever. Richard removed his own ring and gazed at it. Do you know what this means? What? That we've finally kept the promise. That Emily can rest in peace knowing her daughter has the family she always wanted for you. Melissa smiled, feeling her mother's loving presence in the gentle breeze rustling the garden trees. I'm finally home, she whispered. Richard wrapped his arm around her shoulders. It was always our home, Melissa. It just took you a while to get here. 6 months later, Melissa had fully settled into her new life. The house in Woodstock became the center of regular family gatherings. Jennifer had decided to move back to the US, opening an architecture firm in New York, but keeping a studio on the property for when she needed peace and inspiration. Richard had significantly cut back his work hours, delegating more responsibilities to spend time with family. Margaret was thriving in the countryside, actively participating in household life and sharing endless stories about Emily. One Sunday afternoon, as they prepared a family lunch, Jennifer asked the question on everyone's mind. "Aunt Melissa, have you ever thought about looking for your birth father?" Melissa paused her vegetable chopping and considered it. "I have, but I decided some doors are better left closed." "Why?" Richard asked. "Because I have the family I need now," she replied, glancing around the kitchen filled with people she loved. "I don't need anything more from the past." Margaret, seated at the table peeling potatoes, spoke softly. "Melissa, dear, I know it's not my place, but your mother always hoped you'd meet your father one day." Melissa turned to her. "What do you mean?" Margaret sighed. "Emily believed he'd regret the choice he made. She used to say he'd come looking for you someday, and that you should be ready to forgive him, just as you forgave us." Richard stopped stirring the sauce. "Mom, do you know something about Melissa's father you haven't told us?" Margaret hesitated. "I know where he lives. Emily told me in one of the last letters he sent." Melissa sat at the table, suddenly intrigued. "He was still sending letters when my mother passed?" Margaret nodded. "The last one arrived a few weeks before Emily left us. He said he'd married, had other children, but never forgot about her or you, that he hoped to meet you one day." Jennifer moved closer to her aunt. "So, what do you think? Do you want to meet him?" Melissa was silent for a moment. Finally, she spoke. "Not to have a father-daughter relationship. That will never happen. But maybe to give him peace too. To let him know I turned out all right despite everything." Richard smiled. "That would be very generous of you." "Or maybe it's selfish," Melissa said. "Maybe I want him to see what he lost by choosing money over love." "Both can be true," Jennifer observed. Margaret shifted in her chair. "Melissa, if you decide to look for him, I can give you the address from his last letter." Melissa considered the offer. "Let me think about it." That night, Melissa walked alone through the grounds, reflecting on the possibility of meeting her father. She was so lost in thought she didn't notice Richard approaching. "Mind if I join your walk?" he asked. "Of course. I could actually use someone to talk to." They walked in silence for a few minutes before Melissa spoke. "Richard, do you think I'm being naive for considering looking for my father?" Richard thought carefully. "I think you're being brave. And I believe Emily would be proud of the generous woman you've become. But what if he disappoints me? What if he's a horrible man who only brings me more pain?" Richard stopped and looked at her. "Melissa, you faced 40 years of abandonment and still found the strength to forgive us and build a family with us. I think you can handle whatever your father represents." Melissa smiled. "When you put it that way, it does seem like I can. And besides," Richard continued, "you won't be alone. You have an entire family here to support you, no matter what happens." Melissa nodded. "You're right. I'll ask Margaret for the address tomorrow." The next morning, Melissa got the address from Margaret and discovered her father, Michael Thompson, lived in Hartford, just a few hours from New York. "Do you want me to come with you?" Richard offered. "No, I think I need to do this alone, but I'd like you all to be here when I get back." "Of course," said Jennifer. "We'll be waiting with a special dinner prepared." Melissa drove to Hartford the following Tuesday. The address led her to a middle-class neighborhood with tidy houses and tree-lined streets. It was the kind of place where traditional families raised their children in safety and comfort. She stopped in front of the given number and observed the house for a few minutes. It was a well-maintained 1990s construction with a tended garden and a car in the garage. Taking a deep breath, Melissa got out of the car and rang the doorbell. A middle-aged woman answered, her expression friendly. "Good morning, can I help you?" "Good morning, I'm looking for Mr. Michael Thompson. My name is Melissa Parker." The woman's expression shifted slightly. "Michael is my husband. May I ask what this is about?" Melissa hesitated. "It's a personal matter." About something that happened a long time ago. The woman studied Melissa's face, and something in her expression seemed to spark suspicion. "One moment, please." She closed the door, and Melissa heard muffled voices from inside. A few minutes later, the door opened again, this time revealing a man around 65. Michael Thompson was shorter than Richard, with graying hair and a nervous expression. When he saw Melissa, his face paled dramatically. "Melissa," he whispered. "Yes," she replied simply. Michael leaned against the door frame, visibly shaken. "I can't believe..." After all these years, Michael's wife appeared behind him, clearly tense. "Michael, what's going on?" Michael looked at his wife, then at Melissa. "Susan, this is my daughter, the one I told you I had when I was young." Susan looked from Michael to Melissa, her expression cycling through several emotions. "Emily's daughter?" Michael nodded miserably. "Susan knows about you, Melissa. I told her when we got married." Melissa was surprised. "She knows?" Susan stepped forward. "Michael told me the whole story, about how his family forced him to abandon you and your mother. He carried that guilt all through our marriage." Michael found his voice. "Melissa, please come in. We can't talk at the door." They led her to the living room, a cozy space filled with family photos. Melissa noticed several pictures of children and young adults she didn't recognize. Michael saw her looking. "These are my other children. Christopher is 35, Amanda is 32. They know about you." "They do?" Melissa asked, surprised. Susan nodded. "Michael has always been open about his past. The kids grew up knowing they had an older sister out there, one their father hoped to find someday." Melissa sat on the sofa, trying to process the information. "Did you ever look for me?" Michael lowered his head. "I tried so many times. I hired detectives, went to New York looking for you and Emily, but I could never find you." "When was the last time you tried?" asked Melissa. "About 5 years ago. That's when I found out Emily had passed away. I was devastated. I had hoped to one day apologize to her in person." Melissa felt a pang of sadness. "She kept your letters, you know, all of them." Michael looked at her with hope. "She kept them?" "Yes. I read everyone. I read how you regretted everything, how you wanted to meet your daughter, how you hoped you could one day explain your choices." Michael began to cry. "Melissa, I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I failed you in the worst way possible, but I want you to know there hasn't been a single day I haven't thought about you and Emily." Susan stepped closer to her husband and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Michael always said the biggest regret of his life was not having the courage to stand up to his family to stay with you." Melissa studied the couple in front of her. "Why didn't you? Why did you choose your family's money over me and my mother?" Michael took a deep breath. "Because I was young, scared, and naive. My parents convinced me I'd ruin my life and yours if I insisted on taking responsibility. They said Emily was better off without me, that she'd find someone better. And you believed that?" "At the time, yes. But when I grew up and realized what I'd really lost, it was too late. Emily had disappeared, you had disappeared, and I was married with responsibilities that kept me from dropping everything to search for you." Melissa glanced at the family photos. "You all look happy." "We are," Susan said, "but Michael always carried that emptiness. He always knew our family wasn't complete without you." Just then, the front door opened, and 2 people walked into the room, a young man around 35 and a woman of 32. Christopher and Amanda stopped in the doorway when they saw Melissa. "Dad," Amanda said, "is that her?" Michael nodded, tears in his eyes. "Kids, this is Melissa, your sister." Christopher stepped forward first, extending his hand. "Melissa, it's so nice to finally meet you. Dad's talked about you since we were little." Amanda was more hesitant. "Hi," she said simply. Melissa shook Christopher's hand and nodded at Amanda. "Hi to you too. It's surreal to find out I have siblings." "Half-siblings," Amanda corrected, still clearly processing the situation. "Amanda," Susan gently chided. "It's okay," Melissa said calmly. "I get that this is hard for you too. I just showed up out of nowhere in your lives. Christopher sat in the armchair across from her. Actually, we always knew this day might come. Dad never hid that he had a daughter he couldn't raise. Amanda stayed standing, visibly uncomfortable. It's just, you're real now. Our whole lives you were more like a story Dad told. Michael gave Amanda a sad look. Sweetheart, I know this is confusing, but Melissa is your sister, no matter how she came back to us. Amanda sighed. Dad, I'm not questioning that. I just need time to process. Melissa stood. Maybe I should go. I don't want to cause trouble in your family. No, Michael said quickly. Please don't leave. I've waited 45 years for this conversation. Susan moved closer to Melissa. Honey, why don't you stay for lunch? We can talk more. Really get to know each other. Melissa hesitated, glancing at Amanda, who still seemed uneasy. Amanda, Christopher said to his sister, remember when we were kids and always wondered what it'd be like to have our big sister with us? Now we get to find out. Amanda studied Melissa's face. You really do look like Dad. You have the same eyes. Melissa smiled faintly. People always said I had familiar eyes, but I never knew who I'd inherited them from. Amanda finally sat down. All right, let's talk, but I want to know everything about your life. I want to understand who you are. During the lunch that followed, Melissa shared her story with the family. She spoke about her difficult childhood, about discovering Margaret and Richard, about finding her true family after decades of loneliness. Michael listened with growing pain in his expression. Every hardship Melissa described felt like a stab to his heart. Melissa, he said when she finished, I can't imagine how much you've suffered, and to know I could have prevented all of it. Michael began to cry again. His family watched in silence, seeing a man who had carried guilt for decades finally face the consequences of his choices. Melissa looked at him with a gentle expression. Michael, can I call you that? He nodded, unable to speak. Michael, I spent a long time angry at you. Angry at the man who abandoned me before even knowing me. But now, seeing you here, seeing your family, I understand you've suffered from your choices too. Michael looked at her through his tears. Can you forgive me? Melissa considered the question carefully. Forgiveness is a complicated word. I can't say I fully forgive you because it still hurts knowing you chose an easy life instead of fighting for me. But I can say I don't want to carry anger anymore. Susan smiled through her own tears. Melissa, that's more generous than Michael deserves. Maybe, Melissa said, but I've recently learned that holding on to anger only hurts the one who carries it. I'd rather choose peace. Christopher leaned forward. Melissa, what does this mean for us? For our family? Melissa looked around the table. It means I'd like to get to know you all better. Not as the daughter Michael abandoned, but as the person I am today. If you'd like, of course. Amanda spoke for the first time since they'd sat down to eat. I'd like that. I've always wanted an older sister. Michael smiled for the first time since Melissa had arrived. That would be a dream come true for me. Melissa nodded. But let's take it slow. No pressure, no unrealistic expectations, just let's see what happens. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking. Christopher told her about his work as an engineer. Amanda shared about her teaching career. Melissa realized that, despite their different circumstances, they shared some personality traits. When it was time to leave, Michael walked her to the car. Melissa, he said, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you have a family now? People who care for you? Melissa smiled genuinely. I do. A family who found me when I needed them most and taught me the true meaning of unconditional love. Michael sighed in relief. I'm glad. That's all I ever wanted for you. Michael, can I ask you something too? Of course. Did you really love my mother? Michael closed his eyes for a moment. I did. More than anything in the world at that time. That's why it was so hard to leave her, and why I could never forget you both. Melissa nodded. She loved you too. Even after everything, she never spoke badly of you. She always said you were young and scared, not cruel. Michael began to cry again. Emily was always too generous. She was, and I think she'd be happy knowing we finally met. Melissa drove back to Woodstock with her heart full of conflicting emotions. Meeting her father had been less traumatic than she'd expected, but also less satisfying than she'd imagined. When she got home, she found the whole family waiting anxiously on the porch. "Well?" Jennifer asked, rushing to hug her. "It was enlightening," Melissa said. Richard stepped closer. "Do you want to talk about it?" Melissa looked at her family, Richard, Jennifer, and Margaret, and felt a wave of gratitude. "I do. But first, I want to say something to all of you." They watched her expectantly. "Meeting my biological father made me realize just how special you all are. He gave me life, but you gave me love. He brought me into this world, but you raised me, even if it was later than it should have been." Margaret began to cry. "Melissa, sweetheart." "No, let me finish," Melissa said softly. "Michael is a good man who made a terrible mistake when he was young. He has a family who loves him, and now I can be part of it too in some way. But you are my real family. You're the people I choose to have in my life every day." Richard hugged his sister. "Thank you for saying that. It means everything to me." Jennifer joined the embrace. "For us too, Aunt Melissa. You changed our family." In the weeks that followed, Melissa stayed in touch with Michael and her half-siblings. They met occasionally, slowly building a relationship based on the present, not the lost past. Christopher showed particular interest in getting to know Richard and Jennifer, curious about the family who had cared for Melissa when he couldn't. Amanda took longer to warm up, but she gradually began to see Melissa as the sister she'd always imagined having. Michael, for his part, seemed to finally find peace. Knowing Melissa was well, that she had a loving family and that she didn't hate him lifted a weight he'd carried for decades. 2 months after their first meeting, the two families gathered at the house in Woodstock for a big lunch. Richard had insisted on meeting Michael, not out of hostility but out of curiosity about the man who had fathered his sister. The gathering was tense at first, but it gradually turned into a genuine conversation between people who shared something important, their love for Melissa. "Michael," Richard said at one point, "I know you regret the choices you made, but I want you to know Melissa became an incredible woman. You can be proud of her." Michael smiled sadly. "I am proud, but I know I don't have the right to be. I did nothing to deserve such a special daughter." Margaret, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, finally spoke. "Michael, all of us here have made mistakes when it comes to Melissa. What matters is that we're trying to do better now." Michael looked at the elderly woman. "Are you Richard's mother?" Margaret nodded. "And also the woman who broke her promise to care for Melissa. If Melissa can forgive me, maybe she can forgive you too." Michael was surprised. "You too?" Richard told Michael Margaret's story, and he listened with growing understanding. "So, we've all failed her in some way," Michael finally said. "And we're all here now, trying to do better," Jennifer added. "That's what matters." Melissa, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally spoke. "Do you know what I've learned these past few months?" They all turned to her. "I've learned that family isn't about perfection. It's about choice, about deciding to love each other despite mistakes, despite flaws, despite hurts." Richard smiled. "Emily would be proud to hear you say that." "I think she'd be proud of all of us," Melissa said, "for finding our way back to each other." 6 months later, Melissa was organizing another family dinner in Woodstock. This time the table was even bigger, seating not just Richard, Jennifer, and Margaret, but also Michael, Susan, Christopher, and Amanda. Over time, the two families had blended naturally. Christopher and Richard discovered they had a lot in common in business. Amanda and Jennifer became close friends, bonded by architecture and design. Susan and Margaret formed an unlikely partnership, sharing stories about their families and supporting each other. During dinner, Margaret made an unexpected announcement. "I have something important to tell all of you." The table fell silent. I've decided to officially donate the nursing home to a community project. I want it to be turned into a care center for seniors who don't have family. Everyone looked at her in surprise. Melissa taught me that family is about choice and love, not just blood. I want other seniors to have the chance to find family too. Richard smiled. Mom, that's wonderful. And I want Melissa to be the project coordinator, Margaret continued. She knows what it's like to grow up without family, and she knows how precious it is to find one. Melissa was moved. Mrs. Margaret, it would be an honor. Jennifer clapped her hands. I can design the necessary renovations. And I can help with the funding, Richard offered. Michael raised his hand timidly. Can I contribute too, as a way to honor Emily's memory? Melissa looked at him fondly. Of course, Michael. Mom would be happy knowing you're helping others. 6 months later, the Emily Parker Care Center was officially opened. It was a beautiful, welcoming place where lonely seniors could find not just care, but also family. On opening day, Melissa's entire extended family was present. Richard had brought several clients from Blackwell Construction, interested in supporting the project. Jennifer had documented the entire renovation process. Michael had mobilized his contacts in Hartford to promote the initiative. But the most emotional moment came when Melissa cut the ribbon, wearing Emily's pearl necklace and the sapphire ring on her finger. This home is dedicated to the memory of Emily Parker, she told the small gathered crowd, a woman who believed everyone deserves to be loved and cared for. May this place be a home for all who need family. Richard approached her as the ceremony ended. Melissa, look around. See how many people came to celebrate your mother and the project you've created. Melissa took in the scene. Seniors chatting animatedly with young volunteers, families exploring the facilities, children playing in the gardens Jennifer had designed. It's perfect, she said. It's exactly the kind of place where people can find family when they need it most. Margaret, now using a more comfortable wheelchair, joined them. Melissa, dear, your mother would be so proud. I think she is proud, Melissa said, glancing at the blue sky. I think we've finally understood the lesson she wanted to teach us. Richard smiled. That family is about unconditional love and second chances, and that it's never too late to choose love over anger, Melissa finished. As the sun began to set, the whole family gathered on the main house's porch. Melissa looked around at all the people she now called family. Richard and Jennifer, Margaret, Michael and Susan, Christopher and Amanda. May I propose a toast, she asked. Everyone raised their glasses. To the sapphire ring that brought two families together, to Emily, who planted the love that led us here, and to proof that it's never too late to come home. To family, they all said in unison. As the sun dipped behind the Woodstock Mountains, Melissa held the sapphire ring and whispered a silent prayer of gratitude. It had taken 45 years, but she was finally home, surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally. Richard wrapped an arm around his sister's shoulders. What are you thinking? I'm thinking my mother was right. Love always finds a way to bring us home. And so, under the starry sky of Woodstock, the family that had been separated by decades of fear and misunderstandings finally reunited in full, living proof that some promises, even broken, can be mended when there's enough love to try. The end of the story. Now tell me what you thought of this touching tale. Do you believe Melissa made the right choice by forgiving everyone who hurt her? How would you react if you discovered a long-lost family after so many years? Share your honest thoughts in the comments. It helps us so much. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss other heartwarming stories.